for the live stream. Here we go. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the First District Court of Appeals. We have one case for Zoom argument set today, and that is State of Ohio versus Gustavo Olan, case number C230228. For the appellant, we have David Hoffman. Good morning.
Good morning, Your Honor.
For the appellee, we have Joseph Cousins.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning. Mr. Hoffman, would you like to reserve some rebuttal time?
5 minutes, please, Your Honor.
Okay, I'll keep your time. It's a little difficult on Zoom because I don't have the lights. So
Okay.
I'll try to signal when you're close to your time.
Thank you. Generally speaking, the prosecution may not use statements stemming from a custodial interrogation of the defendant unless it demonstrates that the defendant was at first advised of his Miranda rights. In this case, the claim is that this was a custodial interrogation involved. There was no advisement of Miranda rights, and the defendant's statements should have been suppressed.
And were those, when the statements you're talking about should have been suppressed, were those his acknowledgement through the Google Translate of potential participation in prostitution?
Yes, Your Honor.
And I guess, like, do we have a record of what Google Translate actually said? Or we just have like the officer's account of, well, I asked Google Translate this and it said this. Like, is there any issue of whether what he actually understood the officers to be asking?
No, there was no claim that he couldn't understand what the officer was asking. There were three factual issues I wanted to clarify that aren't spelled out clearly in the brief. The first is that this stop took place at 11 p.m., not earlier in the evening. And I think the fact that this happened later in the evening tends to weigh in favor of finding that it might have been custodial. The second clarification is that, excuse me, the defendant's passport was taken, and for about 15 minutes, the police tried to use it to find any kind of contact, police contact with the defendant in Kentucky or in Ohio, and it appears they were unable to come up with anything. And I think that would indicate that the defendant had never been arrested before, that he was sort of a novice, or he was a stranger to the judicial system. And I think that would also factor in an objective fashion to that the police citizen contact in this case would tend more to be custodial. But the most important clarification,
when he was questioned, had he been given his passport back yet, or did the officer still have it?
The officer still had it, Your Honor. One of the officers. It's about 32 minutes into the officer, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Shadaler, his body cam. It shows that the F-150, Mr. Oland's F-150, was facing another parked car. You'll remember from the facts that he parked on the wrong side of the road, so his truck would have been facing the other cars that were parked on the road, and it's clear from the footage, most of the footage, that there were two police cars directly behind his truck, one police car right next to his truck, a little bit beyond it, but right next to it. But only in a very small part of the body camera footage can you tell that there's also a car facing his truck. It's hard to tell how far away it is.
So in other words, like, according to your argument, there's no way that even if the officers had said you're free to go without moving their cars or someone else moving a car, there's no way he could have pulled his truck out.
It's a little closer question than that. I used to drive a Ford Fiesta, which is the smallest car that Ford makes. I would have been able to zip right out of there. But I think with an F-150, you would have really had to have been careful to get out of that situation and not clip one of the cars, either the parked car or the police car. It looked close. And so it's hard to tell in the video, but I think that, I mean, and it isn't a situation like Bailey where he's totally boxed in, but I think he's effectively boxed in. I think it looks like it would have been very difficult for him to navigate out of that situation if he wanted to leave. So yes, I'm saying
what was the time point on the body cam where he was actually arrested? Do you remember what minute that was?
It was 14 minutes and change, it looked like.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of processing between that and this observation about the parked car. And so it might have been easy to miss if somebody was just looking for facts leading up to the arrest. So, but when you watch the whole thing, it's pretty clear that he had cars in front of him, next to him, and behind him. So, the other facts that I think tend to show confinement, or not confinement, custody, are what I've already spelled out in my brief. I mean, you've got a young Mexican immigrant man who he can't speak English, never arrested before, detained by police in 3 police cars, sees his passenger arrested, had his passport taken and kept. He's on a residential street being questioned at 11 p.m. I think a reasonable person in that situation would tend to feel that, objectively speaking, would feel that he's in custody. You don't need
Can I ask you, with regard to the language barrier, a lot of the cases that talk about this being a factor are situations where there was no Google Translate involved. And you were asked earlier, and I believe you said that you didn't think he'd had any trouble understanding with the Google Translate. So, you know, is there an argument that he didn't understand or have a complete understanding of his overall situation? Or do you think that the Google Translate was enough to kind of help him understand what the officer was trying to do here?
There is no indication that he couldn't understand the Google Translate, and there's no indication that he was unable to communicate with the officer using Google Translate.
Because aren't the other cases where you take into account the language, the lack of English proficiency, aren't those situations where there was no kind of translation involved and the person was just trying to like answer questions to the best of their ability and they didn't quite understand what was going on?
Well, I could only find a couple cases, and the cases I found didn't go into that. That I read that didn't go into that deeply. What was
the point? What in those cases? What was the reason why the court took the language problem into account? Like what?
Well, the cases said that the cases that I searched for indicated that although the inability to the language barrier was unique to the person, it was still a fact that formed an objective basis for ruling on the custody issue. And that was mostly what I was getting at in citing those cases.
Well, and there was a point made in the brief about how he had typed something on his phone or had used Google Translate on his phone and was trying to show it to the officer, but they didn't want to look at it or something like that. And I think that's kind of what part of my question earlier was getting to, was like, you know, if he had said something like, I don't understand what you're saying, or something like that, that could have been helpful from his perspective in this overall analysis. But we just don't have the record of what was on the phone because he didn't testify, right?
That's correct. He didn't testify. We don't know what was on the phone. And so there was a back and forth exchange with the phones. And when he held up his phone, the officer then quickly held up his phone. And then Mr. Olin responded to what was on the officer's phone, and the officer appears not to have responded to what was on Mr. Olin's phone. So And I think I noted that it happened twice like that. And so because of that, I thought that it was a bit dominating, appeared to be dominating with the officer's questions.
You have about a minute left of your initial time.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. That's about all I wanted to cover. Unless the court has any other questions, I think that this case is closer than obviously Bailey. That didn't involve handcuffs. It didn't involve threats. But I think that each case has to be decided carefully. And I think when you look at the exchange with the phones and also this configuration of the automobiles at the stop, I think the court could find that the trial court erred and not considering that configuration and in holding that this was not custodial. I think it was custodial and the statement should be suppressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Parsons?
Good morning, Your Honors.
Good morning.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. I just, may it please the court, I want to address some of the three issues that Mr. Hoffman brought up. First, starting with the contention that the 11 p.m. Stop tends to weigh in terms of custodial. I don't think the time of day where the stop took place tends to make this any more or less custodial.
Right. No, I agree with that. I think the things to me that look like custodial, and I just would like your response to this, is he's surrounded by police officers, both physically and by their vehicles blocking his car. They've arrested the woman that he was with, and she's, I think, in handcuffs. And they take his passport, which for someone, particularly someone who's not a US citizen, the seizure of the passport has got to be a significant, consideration that, like, you are not free to go. These guys with badges have my passport. So could you address, like, from your perspective, how those factors aren't enough to make this a custodial interrogation?
Yes, Your Honor. So starting with the restraint on Mr. Olan's motion, his car, I think comparing this to Bailey, the officers blocked his car in completely with police vehicles. There may have been another car in front of Mr. Olan's vehicle where he had parked, but there wasn't a police vehicle in front of his vehicle completely blocking him in. From just looking at the body cam, I think that he could have feasibly maneuvered his vehicle out of there. Mr. Olan, throughout this entire encounter, is moving in and out of his vehicle, walking around while talking with officers. Regarding the passport, the officers did seize it in order to one, obviously try to identify the defendant. I think that, that's necessary in this situation to find out who he is, find out if the car is his, find out any number of information,
Are you aware of any cases that discuss whether taking somebody's passport or identification could be a custodial situation or not?
I'm not aware of any specific cases. I think that it is a factor to be considered in the totality of the circumstances. I don't believe that that is dispositive of this being.
Do we know what the officers conveyed to him about his passport and their desire for it and whether they were going to give it back? Did they explain that?
I don't believe
when they
that
testified?
I don't believe that that was ever explored in the motion.
Well, he clearly knows he's not free to go because they have his passport, right? Like, there's just no way you can leave without your passport in that situation.
Correct. But I mean, it's the same with any, I would say, any encounter with police. If you're pulled over for any reason, you're not going to have your driver's license for a period of time.
Right, but when I think the issue is that he kept, so look, maybe I should ask you. He went and he looked at the passport or used the passport to see if he had any outstanding warrants, right?
Correct.
And then when he determined that he did not have outstanding warrants, he came back and he did not give the passport back, but that's when he started to ask him questions. Is that when the incriminating statements came out? After he already checked him to see if he had warrants?
Um, I think, Your Honor, that I'm sorry. I think it's kind of unclear exactly how that played out. I think that they did hold on to it and asking the questions. I believe one officer may have had the idea, and another officer was questioning the defendant, Mr. Owen.
But
So
I
I
was
think
just wondering if it was before or after they looked up whether he had warrants by using the
bel-
passport.
I think to an extent these may have been happening at the same time. There were multiple officers there. There was an officer in the car who was looking at the passport, and then there was, I believe, another officer. I believe it was Scheidler was the one who was talking with Mr. Owen.
Okay. So it was happening simultaneously.
To my knowledge, yes, that was a sort of simultaneous. I think there was some overlap.
Okay.
The point of the woman in the fact that the woman was arrested, Miss McLean, I believe her name was, I don't think that really bears on how this could be considered a custodial stop. She was arrested because she had open warrants. Mr. Olan was not arrested immediately because he didn't have any. I don't think it's fair to say that just because his passenger was arrested, that the driver of the vehicle should then fear that he'll be arrested. I don't think it's not mutually exclusive. If one person's arrested, it does not mean the other person is going to be arrested. I don't think that tends to make this any more custodial than.
Well, but he doesn't know why she's being arrested.
Correct.
So I don't know, if I was in a car and was pulled over by the cops and they arrested my passenger and didn't tell me why, I would be concerned that I was going to be next, right?
Well, I suppose you could look at it that way. I would think if I'm driving and I'm pulled over and my passenger gets arrested, I think it's also reasonable to think, oh, what's going on here? I didn't know my passenger had open warrants.
Right.
I wouldn't just instantly think they're coming for me next. I don't think that an objective person would necessarily think that, well, they got the passenger, they're going to get me next.
I believe in the brief that the argument with regard to the passenger being arrested was presented at that point in the context of that the officers had already formed the intent to arrest Mr. Olin well before the interrogation took place.
That is argued by the defense attorney, and perhaps they do learn eventually that the woman who's arrested does have a history of engaging in prostitution, and the officers do acknowledge that this looks like a situation where prostitution could be at play, so they do begin an investigation into it, which they do by.
Well, the investigation is questioning and basically saying, like, were you procuring the services of a prostitute? So they've identified him as a suspect. They believe that he's engaged in an illegal act, and now they're going to question him to confirm that, obviously without Mirandizing him.
Yes, they do question him, Your Honor. They use the translator app, and the police are, I believe the police are allowed to ask questions in this investigation. The questions were, they were specific, they were targeted, but I don't believe that is, I don't think Miranda warnings aren't required simply because an investigation is focused. I believe in State versus Montgomery that is elaborated upon.
What is the test to determine whether Miranda warnings are required?
Well, Your Honor, the test would be if the ultimate inquiry is how a reasonable man in the suspect's position would have understood his situation. So it's an
Whether a reasonable man would assume that they were free to leave, you mean?
Yes, I apologize.
Okay.
And then in the case State versus Montgomery, there are the 10 factors that are enumerated and analyzed in the briefs. Another point I wanted to address, this occurred on a public road. It's a public location in Bailey. I believe that was in a parking lot, and the defendant was blocked into this parking lot. I think that also tends to make this less of a custodial situation. And additionally, the defendant was never handcuffed while he was being questioned.
Was he in, I can't remember, was he physically in his car or in the police car at the time that he made the Google Translate statements?
He was standing outside of his vehicle. He was not in his vehicle. He was not in the police vehicle. He was standing on the side of the road. I think he was in the grass on the edge of the road. That's one thing about this entire interaction is it didn't happen with him being restrained to being in his own car or being in a police car. The whole discussion took place on the side of the road between Mr. Olan and the officers. I think that right there is very demonstrative of how this is non-custodial. It's not like they're in a small room hammering him with questions. He can't leave. He's boxed into a small area. This is an open encounter. There's discourse back and forth. And I think ultimately that is what makes this non-custodial. One more point that I would like to address is that I think it's important that officers be able to interact with citizens who don't speak English. I feel like if the defense motion Mr. Hoffman's motion is granted and this is remanded, I would fear that there would be a bit of a chilling effect on officers' willingness to use these translation devices and have to instead seek other remedies, call a Spanish-speaking officer or an officer who speaks a different language, which if that were to occur, that would make the detainment, the pre-arrest detention last longer. I think the language issue here is not particularly relevant. I mean, I don't think it's particularly indicative of if this was custodial or not. I think it's a factor the courts may consider. I don't think it is by itself conclusive or indicative. Your Honors, I believe that's really all that I have to argue here, unless you have any other questions.
Thank you very much. Mr.
Thank you.
Hoffman, you have 5 minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think that the test for triggering Miranda, it's not as simple as just whether a person feels they're free to leave. I mean, that it used to be, I think, the test, but now it's a combination of things that includes that factor. But it's whether the pressures or the situation exerts on a person pressures that impair his privilege against self-incrimination. If this whole situation as a whole impairs his ability to exercise his right against self-incrimination, then Miranda should be given before he's questioned.
Well, and
And,
Mr. Hoffman, let me ask you, like, as I read these 10 factors that are from Montgomery and in your brief, you know, some of them certainly point in your client's favor, but some of them point in the state's favor. Are you aware of any case law that gives us guidance on what we are to do when, let's assume, there's roughly equivalent balancing of those factors? Like, are there any factors that are more or less important? Do we have to have a majority of factors defined in your favor? Like, how is our analysis to be guided there?
Well, I personally feel that the use of factors in limiting, you shouldn't be limited to factors, for one thing, because I think it's contrary to the totality of the circumstances rule, that you got to consider all the relevant circumstances, except, of course, excuse me, facts that would indicate or tend to be subjective. Like, for example, there was a discussion about what the police officers were intending to do when they were questioning my client. I think that this focus of the investigation type of thing can lead to a subjective type of analysis for the police officer's intention, and I think that is not something that you're supposed to consider. It has to remain objective. What was known to the subject, you know, what was clear from the facts to the person that needs to feel one way or the other about being in custody. So I think that the court, first of all, should not consider itself bound by these factors, and then I think also that the weight to be given each factor, I think is going to be up to the court. I don't know that one factor might be more important than another, because these cases all have to be taken case by case. They're very fact sensitive, and each case is going to be different as far as the important facts of the case that weigh in. Some of those factors may not even apply at all, but that shouldn't stop the court from relying upon other factors that may be very important. I'm sorry, I can't give any guidance. I'm not aware of any cases that deal with the factors. But the other court asked about the use of the passport. At the very end, when the officer was going to secure the F-150, he had the passport in his hand. But before that, throughout the questioning, I think the passport was in the possession of another officer who was trying to use it to find something, find any contact. And so I think that they weren't finished with it at the time of the questioning. It appeared to me from the body camera footage. And also, it was clear, I thought, that there was no announcement as to the reason for the arrest of the passenger. I thought that the officer Buck just had her get out of the car upon learning her identification, and then had her, you know, put the handcuffs on her. And so that's about all I have left to contribute. I think that the important facts were the arrest of the passenger, the retention of the passport, and the configuration of the cars at the stop. I've been stopped for traffic, speeding, and I got my license back before, obviously before the citation is processed and all that. And so I think the retention of this passport is important. They may have continued to use the passport to try to find some prior contact, but the fact that it wasn't returned is the important thing. and what kind of an effect that would have on a reasonable person. So I'd ask that this court would reverse and the judgment of the court that suppressed that denied the motion to suppress. If there are no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your arguments this morning. The case is now submitted and we will issue a timely decision.